Well, Karl, thank you so much for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am an engineer. Um, I started out at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology studying spacecraft, went on to fly weather satellites for the Air Force, design various space vehicles, including rockets. And then, got married, had kids, needed to go for the higher paying job. And these days I work on fighter planes. But I, still have the urge to think about rockets. And so that has wound up emerging as science fiction. So I am a science fiction writer, most known for my Torch Ship trilogy. So I have been following the current efforts to go back to the moon intensely, and am very happy with current events.
Would you mind giving a plug for your book, Torch Ship?
Oh, I'd be delighted. Torch Ship is, near future, not immediate future science fiction, but a couple centuries in the future. It's hard science fiction. I try to get the numbers right. Actually had somebody on the internet live tweeting how he was checking all of my math as he read the book, and I'd gotten it right, which was a huge relief. But for most readers, what they love is that we have the story of a heroine who's piloting this freighter, and it's just her cover job because she's an undercover spy trying to deal with the tensions between the human cultures, the most powerful of which is so terrified of artificial intelligences that they have outlawed uncontrolled computers. So she actually has to fly her spaceship with a slide rule because she can't bring a new computer to this outfit, the Fusion, because they're just so paranoid about computers that they've effectively repealed Moore's Law. And
That
we have another visitor here called Kethri, who does not read the books, but does her bit to support me as I write them.
that's important. So I got a question. Your heroine in the book, the main character, does she grow up on Earth and go to space, or does she grow up someplace else?
In the Torch Ship universe, there was a huge apocalypse. In the past history, there was a golden age where the artificial intelligences were doing so much for people that it was wonderful. Everybody had everything they wanted. It was paradise. And then something went wrong. We're not sure what, but the computers wound up killing most people, and the survivors fled to space. And so now there is this ring of human occupied worlds surrounding the AI controlled worlds. And so the humans are just really kind of avoiding Earth and the planets near Earth because there are no people left on there. Earth has been depopulated. So Mitchie is from one of the outlying colony worlds.
And did you write it after Artemis was announced or before?
Let's see, I think I was doing most of the writing in 2013, 2014, which I think was before the main Artemis announcements. There had been, previous back to the moon projects. I'd been following, this for decades, and, it seems like once a decade we'd have a project announcing a goal to go back to the moon or go back to Mars. And I'm actually professionally impressed that this time it seems to actually be happening, which after decade of seeing it talked about and money spent and PowerPoint slides shown and then nothing happens. The fact that we have hardware flying that could go, that will be going to the moon. It's just awesome to see it actually happening.
Yeah, I have to imagine that if I'm over at NASA, between December and March, I'm like really nervous because that's going to be like the validation of basically maybe 30 to 40 billion dollars worth of development between the James Webb Telescope being launched in December and Artemis 1 in maybe a February timeframe.
Yeah. So that's yeah, they've got some huge projects finally coming off. Seeing the Webb telescope finally launched is great, because that's over a decade behind schedule, and there were people terrified that sometimes Congress gets so fed up about a program blowing its schedule so badly that they will cancel the program. And there was I mean, I've worked on a project, NPOS, that blew its budget to where Congress canceled it. And that was a weather satellite constellation. And so it's a huge relief and delight to a lot of people that we're finally going to see this telescope fly and start getting the data about the universe that it's going to bring in.
So just coming back to Torchship just a little bit, is there any kind of mention about our next steps on the moon in it? Like, does that come up in some type of historical context?
No, I have to say Torchship is written far enough out that the next 50 years are sort of all sort of merged together for them in historical viewpoint. So these are people, these folks are interstellar colonists, so to them everything between the first rocket and traveling to Alpha Centauri is the same little window. Which for us it's a very exciting time to be in, but for this story there are a couple centuries in the future, and their perspective doesn't give them a good view of this period.
And the reason I'm kind of probing on this point is because this series of videos I see as sort of being a time capsule for people in the future, maybe living on like a Mars colony or colonies, in free space, or maybe around the moons of Jupiter, kind of looking back, like we look back at Apollo and the Wright brothers and Columbus to kind of get an idea of those times. So I'm just trying to imagine who might be watching this video from the future. And I was wondering if, the main character in your book would be a candidate, but it sounds like maybe not.
um Unfortunately, it's like when you watch a James Bond movie, you never see James Bond taking time out to read a history book. And that's the kind of protagonist I have in this story, unfortunately.
No, it makes sense. Yeah, that would be interesting. James Bond goes to school. James Bond, the high school years. And what's be funny is he's such an alpha character in like the movies that may have originated from being in a completely different situation through his upbringing. So he may have been the guy that was bullied in high school. So,
Yep.
so you got interested in engineering and went to MIT. Did you always have a sense that you wanted to build things and make things, or do you remember how that came about?
Well, I can actually blame somebody specific for that. This Robert Heinlein has a whole bunch of stories, most famously The Man Who Sold the Moon. This is Space Cadet, which is something that made a deep impression of me. And this book is probably part of why I was not just going into the space prohibition, but also being in Air Force Space Command, because it influenced me toward doing that side of space operations. And so Heinlein's inspiration, had me thinking about rockets, had me thinking about actually doing things, had a whole bunch of characters who were building stuff and flying stuff and made it look like a cool aspiration. And so that had me going to MIT and actually having as my career goal being chief engineer on a moon base, which my freshman year was when the Challenger exploded. And so a whole bunch of us aspiring space engineers had to scale our ambitions back when we realized the impact of that disaster.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I had actually just visited the Kennedy Space Center for the first time that previous December, and Challenger was on the launch pad. So, um, I actually saw Challenger on the launch pad before um, it blew up. So a little connection there, but that was a really difficult experience. A lot of people remember Challenger a lot more than anything else about the space program.
Yeah. And one of our professors was on the commission that investigated it. And so he came back and was lecturing the department and digging into a whole bunch of the details that did not really get publicized in the report. And so had us thinking there and just really driving home to us student engineers how important it is to get things right, because when an engineer screws up, people can die. And so it is like medicine in that it is a profession with very little tolerance for mistakes.
Was that Richard Feynman?
No, Feynman,
He was at Caltech, I think.
yes, he was a Caltech professor. The MIT professor, wow, it's been over 30 years, so I'm trying to think. Karabrock, I would honestly have to look it up at this point. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. Um, well, I guess how important do you think Heinlein is in terms of motivating like a future generation of engineers? Is he still relevant, and it would be useful for us to encourage children to become familiar with his stories, or do you think something has kind of replaced that?
Um, I think his stories are still good. There is they're showing their age a bit. For example, in Space Cadet, one of the dramatic "you're in the future now" moments early in the story is this guy's out riding his horse and his phone rings. And of course, people reading that in 1950, it's like, wait a minute, this guy's out in the boondocks and he's answering his phone. And nowadays we read that, it's like, dude has a cell phone. Yeah. So we're sort of needing a new generation of books to inspire kids like that. But I think most of them are still ones that I would recommend to teenagers. Specifically the books that Heinlein wrote for teenagers. He had a whole series of them. Um, and there's a lot of current engineers. I think if you went through Jeff Bezos's library and Elon Musk's library, you would find a bunch of well-worn Heinlein paperbacks as part of what got them into this situation. There is kind of a need for, a new generation of books, plugged into the modern culture. And I may tackle that at one point. I know some other writers are trying to do that. There's Galen's Flight by Daniel Sawyer, which is very much that kind of book. And I've read it. It's a fun read, would be great for a teenager. Looking at what kind of future we can be building out on the moon and, in when we start settling the asteroids. So Galen's Flight is one I would recommend for somebody wanting something more up to date than the Heinlein juvenile stories.
And I'm gonna put that also on my reading list. Who is it by?
Uh, J. Daniel Sawyer, Sawyer.
Excellent. Well, one thing about these interviews, it seems like the pile of books I need to read like increases exponentially. So uh, I think after I get down to the 0th interview, I'll be spending the next 2 decades reading all the books that were recommended to me.
Yeah, sounds great. I have to admit my to be read pile is pretty out of control too.
So a few other science fiction authors that were around Heinlein's time, like Jerry Pournelle, and which was a little later, and Frederick Pohl, which was
Mhm.
about the same time. I was wondering if you've read any of their works, and how do you think they compare?
Um, I've read some of Pohl's. Like Heinlein better because Heinlein's more of an optimist, and Pohl sometimes struck me as just a little too cynical for my taste. Um, Jerry Pournelle, also got a bit grim, but I think he was hopeful in the long term. And Jerry had some good engineering adventures. He had one King David spaceship, which was about an isolated colony trying to build themselves a spaceship so that they can prove that they have the chops to be treated as equals by the empire. And so that was, not just an adventure story, but also an engineering story. And Jerry had worked on the space program on the human factors side, so he took his engineering seriously. And so, yeah, I do appreciate Jerry Parnell's work.
I And it's interesting. You're right about Frederick Pohl being a little bit less of an optimist. He has, uh, a lot of books that talk about kind of like the negative side of technology and how to be abused and uh, all of that. I haven't really considered that, but now that you mention it, it seems really true.
Well, there's a lot of cynicism in literature. Part of it is I think English teachers seem to encourage that, and because I have a son in high school English now reading Lord of the Flies, and I'm giving him the total sympathy of, oh God, that book, I hated that book so much, it's such a miserable read. But it's what English teachers are into, and so I think that kind of encourages a lot of writers to go for the grim, cynical, depressing outlook, because that's what the English teachers and the literary critics go for. Um, you know, Optimists wind up selling to people like me, which is not necessarily the biggest market, but I'm damn glad there are some writers doing optimistic books out there.
Absolutely, yeah. Now that you mention about it, in high school we read, Lord of the Flies, but also 1984, Brave New World, Animal
Yeah.
Farm. Kind of. I can't think of any optimistic book that we read.
It's like English teachers, man.
It's all tragedy, no
Yeah.
comedy.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, and the thing is, there is, people talk about tragedy being realistic, but if you had, you know, for example, Game of Thrones was getting talked up that it's such, realistic at showing how harsh things can be, but you know, you can look around at the world and we have built such wonderful stuff. I mean, we have, if you look at things compared to 1,000 years ago, we have raised the standard of living, we have raised literacy, we have raised scientific knowledge so much in the past 1,000 years. And I'm hopeful that we will mostly be continuing that. Yeah, there may be a dark ages in the future, but after the dark ages, humanity picked itself up and got back to work and built cathedrals and figured out the laws of physics and did other wonderful things. And I expect that progress to continue in the future. Um, Not without stuff. I mean, a rocket specific example I have sometimes worried about, because I have been following the rocket business pretty closely from professional interest. And so, in the 1970s, we had OTRAG and American Rocket Company, and AMROC's rocket just fell over on the pad and burned. In the 1980s, we had Space Industries, which had a couple of launches and that never made it to orbit. In the 90s, there were several startup rocket companies, Kistler, Rotary Rocket, and I worked at one Pioneer rocket plane. And all of them spent millions of dollars and never put anything into space. And then SpaceX came along, and it's like, okay, yeah, we got another guy turning a large fortune into a small fortune. And seen this story before, except SpaceX actually put something in orbit. And then they've put even more stuff in orbit, and the guy is actually making a profit doing it. And this is just, I know some people are impressed. I am blazingly impressed because I'm comparing it to this string of dead companies over decades that have failed, and seen SpaceX actually pull it off. And Blue Origin coming behind, and trying to get their rocket. They've just brought a test version of their rocket out to Florida. And so there's all this stuff actually happening, and it just amazes and delights me to see this finally going.
Yeah, I think a lot of people from my generation had dreams of space with like Star Trek, but then the internet kind of like sucked us all into IT type things. And then whenever SpaceX started doing what they're doing, I think it's rekindled a lot of that earlier desire. But do you have any speculation on why SpaceX succeeded where all these other companies who have really brilliant people, really motivated workforces, seemingly were able to build things, but were not?
I think some of it, you have to give some credit to Elon Musk as just being the visionary, and being willing to tackle the technical issues in depth. And and some of it is just these guys work themselves to death. There's a recent book out by Eric Berger called Liftoff, which describes the first few years at SpaceX. And reading about how those guys worked, I once contemplated putting in an application to SpaceX early on, but we wanted to move to Texas instead, so I didn't. But reading that book, I was thinking, man, if I'd gotten hired there, my marriage would not have survived, because these people do nothing but work. They work their asses off, and they have gotten awesome results from it. And I'm impressed as hell with their results. And they're still doing that, because the folks down in Boca Chica, they're building those starships, and they are building the prototypes of what will be a rocket that hopefully lands on the moon well, now we're looking at 2025 instead of 2024. NASA just announced that past week. I don't know if you saw the announcement.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, it's impressive as hell. Some of it, I think they're taking advantage of the growth in computer technology, that they can simulate a lot of stuff and get a head start on their physical testing that way. They're doing a lot of physical testing, and they can analyze the data with the new tools that have been invented. And of course, as computers get more powerful, that lets you put a smaller, lighter computer on board the rocket. So it's not going to weigh as much as the big, bundles of wires that they had on the Apollo rockets. So that's, that may actually be the smallest part of what technology is doing for them.
yeah, exactly. I mean, replacing two wires with a gazillion, the ability to
Yeah,
like, essentially create little modules that are able to send and receive messages simplifies things so much. Like
yeah,
the buses on these new systems are so much simpler than they were.
yeah. And something's probably a big factor is that, with computer controlled machine tools, there's been a lot of advances in manufacturing. And so that lets them actually make the parts faster and more precisely. And SpaceX does an awful lot of their manufacturing in-house. The aerospace industry has a bad habit of subcontracting lots and lots of stuff. because from the viewpoint of some aerospace executives, the ideal system is one that has a part manufactured in every single congressional district, because that way you will get the votes to keep your budget approved. SpaceX is, building stuff in-house, and they're relying on customer dollars rather than government dollars, which, having worked on both, the nice thing about customer dollars is the customer got his launch to orbit or whatever, and so he doesn't care what you do with his money. The government, oh God, they care. They want paperwork proving that you're spending it right. They want paperwork proving you spent it on the right things. They want paperwork saying how exactly it improved. And investor money isn't as bad as the government, but they still want a lot of paperwork to prove that you're going to return a profit to them. So investor money isn't as good as customer money either. Customer money is the best money because you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, it's interesting, but SpaceX is aware of this game. I don't know if you've looked at their website. They have a map of the U.S. with all 50 states, and they show that yes, they have a supplier in every state too.
Yes, they're dealing with NASA, but it's interesting seeing the things, because when I was at the commercial startup Pioneer rocket plane, I had been at TRW's Space and Electronics division, went off to Pioneer, and then when Pioneer entered its death spiral, I went back to TRW and pretty much just asked my old boss for my old job back, and he took me back after a couple of years sabbatical. But you have a very different mindset between a company that is, we are going to do this because we want to do this, and we're doing this because somebody else is paying us to do this. And SpaceX, while they are dealing with the government, and they have their contract for the human lander system as part of Artemis, it's very much clear that whether they got that contract or not, they were going to keep building the Starship. And they have plans that they're going to do. They're not just going to fold up their tents if they don't get contracts. Whereas there's a lot of, my current employer, if they did not have government contracts, they really would not know what to do with themselves. It's purely a government contract operation.
Yeah. And the motivation, I think, is key. I mean, if your motivation is to turn a profit, that really drives one set of behaviors. But if your motivation is to build a million-person Mars colony that's self-sufficient by 2050, that drives an entirely different set of motivation.
Yeah. And, nobody's going to work a 16-hour day, sleep under his desk, and work another 16 hours to get on, a slightly higher share price. But to make that Mars colony happen, yeah, there's guys working like that.
Yeah.
And and if I was 23 right out of college looking for something, man, I would be so wanting to sign up with them. But I'm a lot older than that now, and and my wife and kids need me, so I am cheering SpaceX on, but I am not ready to work those 80-hour weeks.
I know what you mean. There's another rocket company that I've been really impressed with, and for kind of different reasons in a way, Rocket Lab. So I was wondering if you had followed them at all.
I've followed them a little. Some of it is I tend to be more interested in the larger vehicles, and Rocket Lab is doing some good work. It's good to see they're getting hardware into the air, but I have not been following them in detail, just partly because they're launching small payloads, and that has not interested me as much. A lot of it I worry about, I look at something and think, will this scale up? Can you launch big payloads with it? And so you get stuff like, I don't know if you saw the video that Spin Launch had.
Hmm.
So for our viewers, there's these folks who essentially have a spinning Ferris wheel that they spin up to almost Mach 1, and then launch a rocket off the edge of it, which they send up to orbit. I look at it and it's like, okay, you can launch a lot of small payloads that way. But I don't see that really working to scale up to a large payload. And possibly there's a personal bias that if they can't launch something big enough for me to fit in, I lose interest, which I freely admit is a bias.
Well, I think the part that really fascinates me about Rocket Labs is the fact that it originated in New Zealand, a little small country. And kind of, there's a lot of people I talk to, like in Egypt and in Pakistan and, Chile and a whole bunch of other countries who are like, there's like no way I could participate in the space program because I live in this country and there's like no NASA and things. And I like to point to the example of New Zealand, who from seemingly nowhere has created an orbital launch capability privately. And kind of my takeaway is if they can do it, there's really nothing that would keep other people.
Hey,
Yeah, sorry about that. We just had a power outage. Luckily, I'm on my phone, but when the router went out, that disconnected the connection for a little bit since I had
okay,
Wi-Fi. But
okay, I've got you back. Well, for folks outside the United States, yeah, Rocket Labs is a great example in New Zealand. There's a fair number of other countries that have programmed. Russia's kind of running off the fumes of their Soviet program, and they're running out of energy a bit. But China is having a very aggressive space program. India has developed its own launchers and is putting programs up, and several other countries are doing satellites that they will hire other folks. There was a Persian Gulf country, well, one of the countries on the Arabian Peninsula launched an interplanetary probe recently, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which one, but there is space happening. Part of the problem for folks, like you were mentioning, a Pakistani, is the simplest thing for them to do would be to immigrate to the United States and sign up with one of the companies here. The problem is there's an awful lot of government regulations, not just the usual immigration issues, which I know can be very tough for people, but because rocketry has a lot of obvious military applications, the U.S. government is very strict on what citizens of what country can have access to stuff. And this is something that comes up on my day job because even British citizens, a formal ally, people who have a piece of the contract that they're working on, there is information that we cannot give to these British citizens about the project we're working on. Even though these people are building part of the airplane, we can't tell them about other parts of the airplane because of government regulations. And so rocketry has a lot of problems with that. And it can, even if you have a great Pakistani engineer, SpaceX is going to look at him and it's like, wow, we would have to have a State Department agreement and we'd have to do all this extra paperwork on every single document we ever let this guy look at. and no engineer is that good to inflict that level of paperwork on the company. So that's something where the government paperwork puts a lot of restrictions on it. And there's also some, arms treaties, because if you have an Iraqi who, would be great at building rockets, well, there's some, international sanctions on Iraq. I don't know if they've been repealed yet, but building rockets that he wasn't allowed to build was on the list of reasons that we invaded Iraq. So there's a lot of restrictions internationally on rockets, which is unfortunate, but, I'd love to see Pakistan, landing people on the moon. I don't want to see Pakistan launching ICBMs. So it's an imperfect world.
It is. Yeah, and talking about rocket launch companies, Megan Crawford from the Space Fund, who kind of has been tracking launch companies, says there's like something like 125 launch startups that they have at various stages, from being just PowerPoint ideas to actually having test facilities, actually launching stuff. And her kind of take is, we don't need any more launchers. We need people making things to launch. Like we need people creating probes and satellites and space stations and experiments to put on the moon and that type of thing. And I was wondering what your thoughts were there.
Well, we have a start on that. The amateur radio community has started doing some satellites, putting some satellites up to just be radio repeaters to support their hobby. And there are various other CubeSats, which are essentially these very small satellites so that a university can do an experiment. And there are university teams that have built some satellite and put it up. And one of the things about these little satellites is that you can have some rocket taking a communication satellite up to geostationary orbit, and that satellite doesn't use the full capacity of the rocket. So they'll say, we'll take a few hitchhikers along. And hitchhiker is actually a term that gets used in the industry for these kinds of satellites. So we have a start for that. Part of the problem is that right now, launch to orbit is so expensive that there's, you wind up having to get these very precisely machined structures, and you want to use the lightest possible parts and so forth. And you want to use radiation hardened electronics, which are more expensive because you can't afford to put any radiation shielding around them. It weighs too much and so forth. And so that makes doing even the smallest thing very expensive. Part of why people are getting excited about the changes happening. And I think the best summary of this is a blog post Casey Handmer wrote about how Starship will change everything. And if you cut a couple of zeros off the price per pound of getting to orbit, that's suddenly going to make a lot of activities that weren't cost effective before worth doing in orbit. And it also means you can start looking at minimizing your production cost instead of minimizing your weight. And when you're not spending millions to make everything lighter, you've got those millions available to improve the performance of your systems. So there's a lot of possibilities that are going to open up. Lots of things that just didn't make sense before will suddenly become practical options in the next decade or two, as assuming Starship becomes operational and flying frequently. So there's a lot of possibilities there.
I read that article, that blog post as well, and I think it made a really good point. He also kind of focused a little bit on the activities at JPL about how much they spend to make things lighter. And if weight isn't a problem, then you start launching commercial stuff, and you might have all sorts of developments. It changes everything.
Yeah. And I mean, Casey's worked at JPL, working on weather satellites. We had similar issues because, you know, there was some of the problems that the NPOS project, which wound up getting canceled, had, was that they were trying to shove every payload they could onto this one satellite. And there was, you know, a lot of it came down to stuff like, well, we have the one sensor that wants to have 0 vibrations so it can have a perfect look at the Earth. And then we have the other sensor that spins around to go around, and having the spinning sensor and the vibration free sensor on the same satellite did not work well. It made things very difficult for the engineers to try and do, and trying to make those two compatible was a problem. But they were doing it because, you know, it was so expensive to put something in orbit that you could only afford one solar panel, one control computer, one data transmitting antenna and stuff. Well, if it gets cheaper to where each sensor can have its own power system, control system, communication system, you can put all of these on separate satellites and they're not going to interfere with each other anymore. So that's, you know, a very real world situation where we could not deploy the satellite we wanted to have because we were so constrained by how expensive it was to get to orbit. And you know, and this is a problem that's still facing us because, you know, right now that program was going to replace the existing low orbit weather satellites that the Air Force and NOAA operate. And right now we're kind of coasting on the existing supply of the old version of the satellites. And when the last of those die, we need to come up with something new, and it hasn't been built yet. So how we solve that problem is going to be very different depending on whether we're going up on an Atlas or we're going up on a Starship. So it's going to be a big change if Elon actually pulls this off. And given his track record, I would not want to bet against him.
I know. I'm really hoping he does pull it off and soon. And if he does, I think the 2020s and the 2030s are going to be beyond our imagination.
Yep.
So you know about Artemis. Would it surprise you that, you know, the people that I usually run into at Starbucks or on the street or at the mall that I do these interviews with, about 80% of them don't know about Artemis. And I was wondering if that surprises you.
It doesn't surprise me. Part of it is an awful lot of, you know, space stuff is kind of background noise. And there's been this continual series of announcements of, you know, we're going to go to Mars, we're going to have the constellation, you know, system. And so generally every president will have a big NASA announcement. And so people have kind of tuned those out until, you know, there's actually some fiery rocket taking off into the sky. And so, yeah, I'm not at all surprised people aren't paying attention, because announcements like that, you know, generally have not led to much. The fact that we have, it looks like, you know, Artemis actually is going to happen is very exciting to me, because I have seen so many equivalent ventures that never landed anywhere. And I am very happy with this change. It's we have an annual science fiction convention here in DFW called FenCon. So science fiction fans and, you know, related stuff. So you have a lot of space fanatics attending, and we had a panel that I was participating in, discussing some of the issues that are going on with Blue Origin and SpaceX and Artemis and SLS and all of the other things. And one of the things I was making a point of on that panel is I've been attending science fiction conventions for decades, and there's always a space panel. And we're talking about, and there had been this long time where every year we get up there and we talk about, well, the current deep space manned program isn't actually doing anything but PowerPoint. Space Launch System has been postponed another couple of years because they can't get something to work. And so on. And we just cover the same things every year. And then the last couple of years, it's like, well, we've got these Starship, test launches, and we've got Blue Origin doing their Grasshopper flights. And Virgin Galactic actually put somebody into space, arguably. I'll count it. It's high enough, it's high enough that you don't have air to breathe. I'll count it. And things are changing, and it's just wonderful that we can get together and we can look at it. And we're going to be back there next year at FenCon talking about space again, and we're going to be talking about something completely different than what we talked about this year. And that's just amazing that we're having such progress all of a sudden after years of stagnation.
Yeah, hopefully Artemis 1 successfully completed its mission. That would be a big milestone for the whole system.
Yep.
So what are some of the things that excite you about us going back to the moon that you think are really important for humanity?
Well, I think it's a big step toward making us a multi-planet species. I mean, and this is assuming we're going back to the moon to stay. If it's just, if NASA is okay, we have the we have the first woman on the moon, we have the first multiracial man on the moon, and we're done and come home again. It's like, oh God, that would horrify me. What I want is bring people and, stay, and now having, a woman and a multiracial man on the moon, permanently stationed there, not leaving until somebody comes over to take over their job because it's a permanent base. Awesome. That's what I want, because that's an important step on making us a multi-planet species. And we are not immune to what wiped out the dinosaurs. We could go the way of the dinosaurs if we don't pull this off. And we have a window of opportunity, but asteroids and black holes and such could come from anywhere. There was an interstellar rock, Oumuamua, that we saw travel through the system, and that was awesome. Wow, hyperbolic orbit. But if that hit the Earth, we would have totally never seen it coming. We wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. And that's not something that you or I would survive. So, there's, on the long-term, multi-planet species. In the short term, to really have a lot of activity in space, we don't want to haul all our metal and water and oxygen out of Earth's gravity well. It's a lot easier to get our oxygen and metal and water from the moon. And there's been the great discovery recently that there is water on the moon. And tying back to Robert Heinlein, he had speculation that we would find water on the moon in his book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Another one for your to be read pile if you haven't read it already. And we're finding out that, okay, yes, there is water on the moon. We have actually spotted it with satellites. And so the question of whether to export that water for use elsewhere or save it for the lunar colonists who are going to need that water, which was a driving issue in Heinlein's book, is one that's going to come up in a decade or two. So that's, an interesting issue. But having those resources there, that's what we're going to need if we're going to build factories in orbit. If we're going to build power generation stations in orbit, we're going to need those resources. If we're going to have a huge, convoy of ships going to Mars, getting their propellant from the moon would be a lot easier than getting it from Earth. So that's something with a lot of utility if we can build the base there. And there's also some pure science. I think the scientists are going to be just thrilled with what they discover there. So I'm an engineer, so my focus is on the practical stuff of how can this let us build something. But I know the scientists are also going to have a lot of discoveries about the origin of the solar system and the history of the solar system if they can get more time on the moon.
Well, and I know the value of the water ice in the moon, sort of being valued as what would it take to take those resources from Earth to the moon. I mean, if we find it on the moon, then it would be some cheaper minus the extraction and refining and processing cost. But the irony is in order to really make use of the moon, we need to drive down the cost of launch, which actually, Starship is successful, that really decreases the value of those particular resources on the moon. And the other thought I had that I wanted to run by you is, over billions of years, there could have been impacts on the Earth that were energetically enough to actually put stuff in orbit. Some of that stuff may have fallen into these permanently frozen areas of the moon. And there might be little tiny treasures inside of this water ice. It's like in these craters.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a shame to just look at it as being strictly rocket fuel if that's true.
Yeah. Well, one of the nice things about starting with Artemis rather than having a purely commercial moon base is NASA's going to send the scientists first. So they are going to have dibs on first look at whatever's up there. And I've known some astronauts and they take their science seriously. And I know the folks, the first guys who get into that crater are going to be poking around for anything interesting. And if it does turn out that there's some freeze-dried plankton or whatever there may happen to be in those craters, they would be thrilled to find that.
I would say that sending the scientists first would be different than what happened in the Apollo program.
Well, Apollo sent a few scientists, but no, they weren't first. But really the mission of Apollo was not exploring. The mission of Apollo was to look at the Soviet Union and say, anything you do, I can do better. And I think, in terms of, winning the Cold War intimidation contest and making folks say, okay, maybe we don't want to make this a hot war, let's keep it a Cold War. I think Apollo was probably very successful at saving a lot of lives by keeping the whole Cold War from heating up, just by being an intimidation measure. You've probably read Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, and he was talking about it, essentially being single combat between the champions of where the astronauts and the cosmonauts went up to show what they could do better. And part of the problem is the astronauts won that contest so decisively by going to the moon that it sort of ended the need for space activity as part of the Cold War. And NASA found that they were, suddenly, they're just having to do the science budget instead of the single combat gladiatorial budget, which did not allow them to do nearly as much. Um,
Well, some people suggest that maybe we're playing that same game with China. I was wondering what your thoughts were.
we have not gotten to that level with China. Um, China is certainly, demonstrating that they want to play the big boy game. They've put up their first space station module. I think they've had their second crew on it. So they're essentially, I think they're roughly equivalent to where the Soviet Union was with their Salyut missions. Um, and China has displayed a great deal of stick-to-itiveness. So I expect them to keep working on them, which means even if the International Space Station is decommissioned, because parts of it are getting very old and fragile, the Chinese will have something up there while, the International Space Station is deorbited, um, which might put us in the same, situation where we were, after the space shuttle was grounded, when we suddenly had no way to put people in orbit and had to buy rides off the Russians. And I'm sure the Chinese would take a great deal of joy in renting time on their space station to us so that we can have people in orbit. Um, at the same time, it is the typical American mode to play the hare in the tortoise and the hare game. We have some great accomplishment, and then we get lazy and slack off, and then we sprint again. And right now we seem to be in sprint mode, and we will see how that goes, and how long it takes the Chinese tortoise to catch up. But I'm kind of glad that China is playing, because competition is a good way to get Americans to accomplish stuff.
That's true, though. I don't. I mean, we always have the risk of, kind of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads with Russia, but and then we had a lot of proxy wars, I guess, with them in terms of like Afghanistan and maybe other places as well. But it really felt like, and maybe this is all because it's past, but it really felt like that the USSR didn't have any big territorial desires. Maybe Cuba and Venezuela and some other places, but with China though, you have like Taiwan and the other countries in Asia. It feels a little bit more dangerous for some reason. Maybe it's just because we're living through it.
Um, China is definitely having some aggressiveness. You can see it with their support for North Korea, with the threats that they make toward Taiwan, with the naval incidents there's been with the Philippines and Vietnam. There was, go back a couple decades, and there were actually, Chinese Navy ships shooting it out with Vietnamese Navy ships. And China has been very aggressive, building bases on islands in the South China Sea, and actually going to the extent, to the point of taking some reef and building an island and then building a base on it. So China is being aggressive. I suspect some of that is just they have an internal pressure that the Communist Party has to show that it is successful and victorious to hold popular support. Because if suddenly, China is getting its ass kicked, a billion people are going to look at the Communist Party and say, well, what good are you? Which in the old-fashioned expression is referred to as losing the mandate of heaven. And the Chinese are well aware of their history, that a long-running government can get overthrown, and the country break up into warring states. So I suspect there's a lot of internal motivation in China to keep that aggressiveness going, to show their stuff. And it's part of the culture. They actually have a movie that's very popular in China right now about one of the battles in the Korean War between Chinese troops and American Marines. And and the Marines are very proud of that battle because they were outnumbered, surrounded, freezing to death, and still managed to successfully retreat. On the other hand, the Chinese are the ones saying, yeah, you had to retreat. So that's why they made the movie out of it.
That is interesting. I have to see that movie. You by chance know the name of it?
It's about the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, and I don't know if there's an English translation of the movie. But it's a current one. I suspect Googling on Chosin Reservoir movie would probably bring it up.
I'll have to watch it with some Chinese friends and get their impressions.
That
Well,
would be interesting.
if it was safe and affordable, would you take a trip to space?
Yes, I think so. I think my standards for safe are going to be higher now than they would have been a couple decades ago, just because I've gotten, older and a little frailer. If Jeff Bezos came to me and said, hey, want to ride on the Grasshopper, I'd be pretty tempted to take him up on it. I would also have to see what my wife's opinion of it is, because I'm not sure life insurance would cover that, anything that happened on that.
Well, and I guess the thing is, how far would you consider going? Just like suborbital, orbital, around the moon, to the moon, maybe even immigrate to Mars? I mean, like, how far would you consider?
If I was 25, immigrating to Mars would sound great. Right now, I have a kid in college and another one graduating high school this year, and I'm needed here, so I don't get to go emigrate now. But taking the family on an Apollo 8 style trip to go around the moon, yeah, I'd like to do it. I'm a cautious enough person. I'm not going to want to be the first person on the vehicle doing that. But if it becomes a regular tourist run, yeah, I'd like to do that.
Maybe not Dare Moon, but Dare Moon 27 or something like that.
Yeah. That I'd sign up for if I had the money. But unfortunately, I do not have that level of pocket change lying around right now.
Well, hopefully the price decreases, so it becomes.
Yep, and it has been going down, and that's great to see.
Well, those were pretty much the questions I wanted to walk through, but did you have any questions for me or anything else that you wanted to discuss?
I think I sort of diverted off your questions to hit most of my points. You may have noticed me wandering off at times, so I think I've made the points I wanted to make. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
I really appreciate it, and it's meant to be a casual, free-flowing discussion, so that was definitely the right way to go with it.
All right.
Well, you have a good rest of your day, and thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, and enjoy your day. And I'll be checking out your site to see some of the other interviews.
Really appreciate it. Okay, farewell.
Take care.